Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome all of you to day 168 of Humanity Rising, an initiative of Ubiquity University and 315 partnering organizations from all over the world, representing members in 129 countries. We came together in the midst of the pandemic last spring, and we began to offer daily sessions so that people worldwide could come together and share their experiences of what it's like going through this extraordinary pandemic that has put most of the world into some form of lockdown and compelled us into social distancing and wearing masks and into an acute awareness of public health. We thought that the pandemic would expire in the summer of 2020 and then maybe in the fall, but here we are in late January 2021, and the pandemic is still in full force in most of the world, and governments and people are still grappling with how we deal with this unprecedented event that has compelled all of us to undergo the same experience at the same time. One of the practices that we introduced on the first day was the practice of heart coherence. Because in this time of strife, in this time of uncertainty, in this time where the very foundations of our world have been shaken, the most important thing that we can do is build islands of coherence in the raging sea of chaos all around. So I would like to invite everyone as we begin our session today to just pause and take a few deep breaths and close your eyes and place your attention on your heart. See if you can just listen to your heartbeat for just a minute. And in the spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving for just being alive, attuned with the heartbeat of others. Thank you, everyone. Now, with a full heart and an open heart and gratitude for all of you joining with us today, I want to introduce our program by calling our attention to the reality in our world that for all of human history, up until August 6th, 1945, every individual had to live with the certainty of his or her own personal death. But when the United States dropped the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and 3 days later over Nagasaki, what was inaugurated into world history was not only the certainty of individual death, but the possibility of species death, planetary death, through the massive development of nuclear weapons. And every day since then, there's been this omnipresent specter that immense damage could be done by the push of a single button. Many of us are preoccupied with climate change, which is also one of those phenomena that could initiate the death knell of our species. But somehow, in some strange way, the nuclear weapons issue and the dangers it represents have receded into the background. And most of us don't even think about it, even though most of the nuclear weapons programs are on hair trigger alert around the world. So today we are particularly delighted to introduce a program, because it was today that the United Nations treaty banning nuclear weapons, the first treaty to ban nuclear weapons, is coming into force. And you may have caught in the news yesterday that President Joe Biden, in one of his first acts, one of his first executive orders, extended the new START treaty for the next 5 years after President Trump and Vladimir Putin had let most of the other treaties lapse, which would have allowed a new nuclear arms race. So Humanity Rising celebrates today. We want to celebrate the United Nations. And I want to welcome my very old friend, Cynthia Lazaroff. We were reminiscing that we met back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the Clamshell Alliance back in 1978, when the nuclear power movement, the anti-nuclear movement, was just getting underway. And the Seabrook nuclear reactor was being built and fired up, and we were trying to stop it. And we were nonviolence training partners in those days. And Cynthia, as you know, because she's been on our Humanity Rising sessions a number of times, she convened the sessions on Hiroshima and Nagasaki with real dignity and grace. And she's been one of those activists of our generation, as Paul Simon says, still crazy after all these years, along with me and Rick and many, many other people who've been on the front lines 24/7, 365 to ensure a better world. How many of us have lived our lives on the front lines? Cynthia Lazaroff is one of those precious souls who's done that. So Cynthia, I'm honored, and we're all privileged for you to commence our program today. Welcome to Humanity Rising.
Jim, I'm moved to tears. I'm just, thank you for that beautiful introduction. I'm so deeply honored to be here, and that meditation just brought us all together in the heart, and to be with you all again at Humanity Rising. It's just, I'm just so excited to be here with you all today to celebrate entry into force day for the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's such an historic moment for all of us, for all of humanity, for our planet, for our children, for our future. And Jim, I just want to say again to you, deep bows of gratitude for this gift of Humanity Rising, for convening this sacred community of caring and compassionate people from all over the world, day after day during this pandemic since last May. This is truly, truly an amazing gift for all of us. So deep bows. Today, we're going to be honoring and celebrating the work of 3 extraordinary women who have all been dedicated to this treaty. And we wouldn't be here without their tireless efforts and the efforts of thousands and thousands of people around the world who have come together to change our nuclear story, to bring forth this treaty to ban nuclear weapons from the face of the earth forever. And I want to welcome now to open our session my dear friend and beloved elder in our community here on the island of Kauai, Hawaiian cultural practitioner Kumu Hula Puna Dawson, also my beloved teacher. Puna travels the world sharing aloha, building bridges for peace between the peoples of the Hawaiian Islands and the peoples of other countries. Puna will open our celebration today with a blessing for the treaty. And so, Auntie, I just want to welcome you and say aloha and mahalo for being with us, and would be so grateful and honored for you to share your blessing now.
Aloha, everyone. I am in awe of all that has happened and will continue to happen. I ask all of you, I bless nothing, but we as humanity, we bless the world with the intentions of love, trust, hope, and faith. So please join me into your lift it up to the world. And we say, O Great Spirit, your breath fills us. The sun that you've created gives life to all of the earth and all of its people. The moon in the night sky lights our way. The stars in the heavens are like the people on earth. They give glory and praise. The many beautiful, wonderful, soft breezes carry your message. From the heavens, the rain falls and it goes into our oceans. The rainbow of many colors recognizes that it touches the heavens and the earth with the promise of hope. This rainbow that shines through all of us. We say to you, Great Spirit, we open our arms. We ask for the blessings for the whole world. We say to you, mahalo for these gifts. Here is peace. Here is peace. Peace begins with you. Peace begins with all of us. Let us be this blanket of aloha. Let us wrap the whole world in truth. Let us be a part of all these new beginnings. Let us continue to take care of the best of the past, putting it here in the present. so it will be there for everyone in the future. With all these things, we say to this blanket of Allah, Mahalo.
Mahalo, Auntie. So grateful for your blessing. And I can't think of a more perfect way to open our session, and so blessed to have you with us today. Mahalo, mahalo. Now on to the treaty that we're celebrating today. On July 7th, 2017, 122 countries adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the United Nations. We also call this the TPNW. Since then, 86 countries have signed the treaty, and on October 24th, 2020, UN Day, marking the 75th anniversary of the birth of the United Nations, Honduras became the 50th country to ratify the TPNW. With the 50th ratification, the treaty was set to enter into force in 90 days. And today, January 2nd, 2021, is day 90, entry into force day for the treaty. Today, we still have 13,500 nuclear weapons in our arsenals, enough to destroy our world many times over. And if we were just to use even less than 1% of these weapons, less than 70, it would be a civilization-ending event, a climate-changing nuclear winter. It would mean the end of life as we know it, the end of everything and everyone we know and love and cherish on this earth. At a time when our US former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, says that we're at a greater risk of a nuclear catastrophe than at any time in history, even than during the Cold War, the TPNW is an existential imperative. Otherwise, we will continue to teeter on the brink of possible extinction. The TPNW is different than any other nuclear weapons treaty that has come before. It is the first nuclear weapons treaty based on humanitarian, not military law. The first to address, quoting from the treaty, the quote, catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. It's the first to address radioactive racism, the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous peoples, the disproportionate impact on women and girls, and the first to provide for compensation and assistance to victims of nuclear use, testing, and production. It's the first to challenge the nuclear apartheid and nuclear colonialism of prevailing global nuclear policy that legitimizes the possession of nuclear weapons by UN Security Council members, the US, Russia, China, Great Britain, and France. It's a policy which holds the rest of the world hostage to the possibility of nuclear war until these 5 countries fulfill what they pledged to do in Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty over 50 years ago. And that was to end the arms race and pursue complete disarmament. We're still waiting. And we still have a long way to go to get the 9 nuclear armed states to give up their nuclear weapons, which now include India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. But today is a milestone to recognize and celebrate. And I want to share now what Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, who presided over the negotiations at the UN for this treaty, said to me when I asked her about the significance of the treaty entering into force today. And Rick, if you could play the clip with Ambassador White now, I'd be grateful. Rick, there's a sound problem. Shall I try to play? Let me see, I'll go to it.
Cynthia, I'll try it one more time if you want.
Okay, and then I can do it if it
Okay.
does. Okay.
And not legitimate, not And it is going to be for the first time that in international law, this is something that really is really outstanding. Countries not only reject, we consider them illegal and not legitimate instruments of security for the 21st century. And that any use of such weapons will be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of human conscience. This is going to be a very strong way in which we turn around the official discourse from nuclear weapons are necessary to nuclear weapons are illegal and unacceptable. And that is going to have an impact in policy making.
So Ambassador White went on to talk about the enormous work ahead to bring all 9 nuclear armed states on board. And like the abolition of slavery, she said, it's going to take time. But the winds of change are now blowing strong. And with the treaty entering into force today, a new window of opportunity has arrived to eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth forever, once and for all. May it be so. We're now going to hear from the 3 wonderful, dedicated, inspiring women leaders we have with us today. Like the TPNW, these women are all changing the game, all leading in new ways, all showing us a pathway forward to peace and disarmament. And these women are welcoming us, inviting us to join them in the campaign for the TPNW, to roll up our sleeves, get to work and get this done, ban nuclear weapons forever. We don't have a moment to spare. So I'd like to begin by welcoming and introducing Ray Atchison. Ray is the director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, also known as WILPF, which brings an intersectional feminist analysis of weapons and war to intergovernmental disarmament processes. Ray represents WILPF on the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for highlighting the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and for working with governments to negotiate and adopt the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They are the author of the forthcoming book, Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, and they have an honors BA in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Toronto and an MA in Politics from the New School for Social Research. Welcome, Ray. I'm next going to introduce Rebecca Irby. Rebecca is the founding partner and executive director of Peak Institute. Over the last 10 years, Rebecca has served as an education and technology consultant on diversity and cultural awareness initiatives with the New Jersey Department of Education, Rutgers University, the National Liberty Museum, Nagoya University, and many others. Rebecca also sits on an advisory board incorporating social skills training into core programs of schools around the US. She has organized, trained, and facilitated youth forums to the NPT, that's the Nuclear Nonproliferation PrepCom, in 2018, 19, and 20, as well as a high-level forum in conjunction with the New Zealand Foreign Ministry and United Nations. Rebecca has spoken about nuclear abolition and heart-centered leadership at Harvard Law School, the Yale Policy Conference, the Pyeongchang Global Peace Forum, the Free Minds, Free People Conference, Busan Democracy Forum, and will be at Barger Leadership Institute at the University of Michigan this year. Welcome, Rebecca. Next, I'd like to welcome Mary. Mary Olson is a biologist and founder of the Gender Radiation Impact Project. While pursuing research work, she suffered contamination with radioactivity used in the lab. 7 years later, she was called to step up when she heard the US federal government was moving to deregulate a large share of radioactive waste. Her job for the next 28 years was to monitor, educate, and advocate for better radioactive waste policy. Her work led her to research biological sex as a factor in harm caused by radiation, and this led her all the way to work on the global treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Welcome, Mary. And I want to begin with you, Mary. So if you want to turn on your sound, I'm going to start by with a question for you. So Mary, you've done path-breaking work on the disproportionate impact of ionizing radiation on women and girls, and as you say, why gender matters in the atomic age. This played a huge role in making the case at the UN for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thank you so much for your work. For all of us, women and girls and everyone. I would love for you to summarize your findings and tell us the story of how your findings made their way into the landmark treaty that we're celebrating today.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's a wonderful moment to be here within our global family, all of us, all of us. Start the slides, please. Gender and Radiation Impact Project can be found at genderandradiation.org. Next slide. And I want to thank my sister, Lauren Olson, for the use of her art today. Next slide. I'm an educator, and in about 2010, a woman asked me if radiation was more harmful to her compared to a man. My answer to her spoke to pregnancy, and she came back with the clarification that she meant her own body compared to a man. I was shocked. In 20 years in my field, I had never heard that biological sex might be a factor in radiation harm. The Institute for Energy and Environmental Research had published a paper, but I missed that memo. Watching nuclear reactors explode in Fukushima, Japan, a year later, made the question of disproportionate harm of radiation to women urgent. My teacher, Dr. Rosalie Bertel, pointed me to cancer data from the survivors of the 1945 nuclear attack by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, published in 2006 by the US National Academy of Science. The report is available online at no charge, and I could access the data easily. Next slide. And yet it is not easy. The Hibakusha, the survivors, experienced inconceivable premeditated obliteration of their cities by my government. I have to apologize. I am deeply sorry. I wish these events had never occurred. And yet I use the data, and using it links me personally to that horror, but I use it because it is unique. It is the only accessible large data set that includes information on people of all ages and both genders, unlike studies of nuclear workers who are primarily adult males. The findings on radiation and females are simple from this information. Next slide. Among the youngest children, radiation exposure of children results in more cancers across their lifetimes than when the exposure is in adulthood. This is fairly non-controversial. However, there is a surprise. It matters if you are a boy or a girl. Next slide. Among the youngest children, the boys grew up and many suffered cancer. However, the same age girls who grew into adults suffered twice the cancer across their lifetimes compared to the males. Biological sex associated with a doubling in radiation outcome is really unexpected. Next slide. Exposure of adults also showed gender differences that are noteworthy. Looking at cancer deaths, for each 2 men who died of cancer, 3 women died of cancer. In every age group, females suffered more cancer compared to males, and these differences are not fully reflected in current radiation regulations. Next slide. My initial findings were published in 2011 in a paper called Atomic Radiation is More Harmful to Women. In 2014, I was invited by Ambassador Kement of Austria to speak at the Vienna Conference on Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Weapons based on my paper. I was the opening speaker in a room of 1,000 diplomats from the UN and experts, because the ambassador wanted me to make the case that in addition to being an indiscriminate weapon of mass destruction, nuclear has a disproportionate impact on women and girls and persists through time. These are hallmarks of humanitarian law and put the new treaty under the jurisdiction of the General Assembly of the United Nations, in contrast to military law, which is under the Security Council. The General Assembly is a democratic body where each nation has one vote and no one has veto authority. While other nuclear treaties are brokered by the Security Council, the TPNW gives the question of a nuclear-free future to the General Assembly. Next slide. I am thrilled that the findings on gender and radiation are memorialized in the preamble of the new treaty. This is paragraph 4. Cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons cannot be adequately addressed, transcend national boundaries, pose grave implications for human survival, the environment, social, economic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations, and have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, including as a result of ionizing radiation. Next slide. Today, we celebrate this treaty coming into force for the 51 nations that are parties to it. Thank you.
Mary, I just want to thank you again for being moved to look into all of this, and then for bringing your work forward to the world, and for your courage and sharing it. And now it's in the treaty, and you're one of the reasons that we're here today in your work. So thank you so much for this contribution to humanity.
It has been a total honor.
It's really, what a blessing. So I just have a question for you. How are you feeling today? What does the treaty's entry into force mean to you personally? And what does it mean for our world? Would love to just hear what you're personally feeling after all this time and all this work.
Well, this week, as we said earlier, we're learning how to breathe again. And yet this goes back to my childhood when I first understood what a nuclear weapon was. And we have all shared that oppression, that horror. And now I hope we will all share what I'm experiencing as peace breaking out. This is peace breaking out, and people don't necessarily know how that was going to happen. Maybe it doesn't fit their idea of how this treaty should be, but here it is. And together we can embrace this incredible opportunity.
Thank you, Mary. I love it. Peace breaking out. Peace breaking out. Love it. Love it. Love it. So thank you. We'll come back to you at the end. And I now want to come to you, Ray, and welcome you again. And I want to start with a question for you. Just want to, let's see, there you are. If you want to, so Ray, you have dedicated the past 15 years of your life working every day on disarmament, and have played a leading role along with ICANN in the campaign for this treaty that we're celebrating today. Thank you for all of this, for everything that you're doing and that you will do. What is the significance of the TPNW entering into force today? What does this mean for you personally? What does it mean for nuclear weapons? And what does it mean for our world?
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for inviting me to celebrate. And it's so great to be here with all of you today on this amazing day. It's still a little bit surreal for me. We've been doing actions all month leading up to this day, and it still hasn't quite sunk in yet. And I think, you know, part of that is because I've been involved in this process from the beginning as an ICANN activist, and having the conversations with diplomats about what it was that we could do to really break the logjam in nuclear disarmament and move things forward and shake up the status quo. And it's been a long road, sometimes frustrating, but always joyful also. And that's something I really want to share with everyone today, is just how much of a community that we've built over these years working on this treaty. The anti-nuclear community, of course, has been building for more than 75 years. Like Jim said, and as you've said, this is a long effort that has been going on for a very long time. And the work around this specific treaty has been going on for more than a decade. And it's really been an incredible collaboration of activists and diplomats and the Red Cross and other humanitarian agencies and academics and just people around the world that have been keen to see change on nuclear weapons. And so personally, the significance is just watching all of this cumulative work come to fruition. And there's been other milestones along the way, of course, getting the negotiations of the treaty, seeing the adoption of the treaty, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, getting the 50th ratification for the treaty to enter into force. All of these have been significant moments that we've been able to celebrate, which I think is so important to building a movement. And that even though we still have a lot of work to go to see the complete abolition and elimination of nuclear weapons, we've made real progress in that regard. And so that's the significance I want to talk about in terms of what it means for the world, what it means for nuclear weapons. This is, as you said, the first categorical prohibition on nuclear weapons. What we're seeing right now is that these weapons are now on the same footing as the other weapons of mass destruction, like biological and chemical weapons, and other indiscriminate weapons like landmines and cluster bombs. So that on its own is significant, just to have an international law on nuclear weapons being categorically outlawed and comprehensively. It's not just use, or it's not just the threat of use or the development or the proliferation, but it's everything. It's all of these things. It's possession, any practices related to nuclear deterrence or nuclear sharing. It's all outlawed. And of course, this treaty right now is only binding on the states that have ratified it. That's how international law works. But as we're going to talk about a bit later, this will have a normative impact on the policies and behavior of all countries in the world. The other significant thing I really want to mention about what this means for the world is this is the first feminist law on nuclear weapons that we have. It was a feminist process to achieve it as well, which I think is really significant. This was really an experience of countries that are nuclear free, working with activists, working with survivors of nuclear weapon testing and use, and standing up to power, which is a very feminist thing to do, disrupting dominant narratives around nuclear deterrence, taking down long-held traditional views about how things work, how the world works, who gets to have a say on these weapons. This treaty and the process to achieve it challenges all of that. It really created an equal footing for all countries of the world to participate, for activists and survivors to participate right along with them and have a say in what went into the treaty. And then the treaty itself recognizes for the first time what Mary was just talking about in terms of the disproportionate impacts of radiation on women and girls, but it also recognizes for the first time the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous communities and the suffering of the hibakusha, of the atomic bomb survivors from Japan and from nuclear weapon testing around the world. It's also the first nuclear weapon agreement to include provisions around victim assistance and environmental remediation. These are all firsts for the nuclear weapon landscape. It broke ground in so many ways that I think we're only starting to recognize and that will propagate as peace breaks out, like Mary says. I think that's a great way to explain it, because as much as the folks who have dominated this discourse for so long would like to tell us that this treaty has no meaning and is futile and irrelevant because the nuclear armed states aren't on board, they're just so very wrong. And it comes from a place of fear, I think, a denial of the fact that they're losing their grip on the reality of nuclear weapons.
Ray, that was beautiful. And, I'm so happy you brought in the feminist aspect of this, and for people to really understand that this is revolutionary. And it was such a really democratic process, this treaty of people of engaging people who have never been permitted to have a voice before. It's so inclusive, and so it's such a model, especially for the time that we're in now. So Thank you for that beautiful, beautiful explanation. What is the pathway forward for the treaty now that it has entered into force? What do you see as the next steps? And what do you see as the strategy for getting the 9 nuclear armed states on board in particular?
Yeah, well, there's a few things that we're going to be working on over the months and years to come. So first of all, as you mentioned, in October, we got the 50th ratification, which enabled the treaty to enter into force. But we still have many, many states that support the treaty and plan to join. So we will be undertaking initiatives to get as many countries as possible to sign and ratify the treaty. Since Honduras ratified in October, Benin ratified in December, and just today, Cambodia ratified. So we're at 52. And we're hoping for more to come in the weeks ahead, in the months ahead. And we'll be building up that community of states parties leading up to the first meeting of states parties. We don't quite know when that will take place, as everyone has experienced. Planning ahead is very difficult these days in our new world of a pandemic, but most likely it will be towards the end of this year or early next year. And so that will be something that we're also working on. And there's going to be decisions that the states parties have to make at that meeting. And it's really going to be an opportunity to galvanize more support for the treaty. When it comes to the nuclear armed states and the other nuclear supportive states that have not yet joined the treaty, we're going to be focusing a lot of efforts on them. So in addition to the 9 nuclear armed, there's also this category of countries that don't possess nuclear weapons, but they still provide cover for the nuclear armed states. They say that nuclear weapons provide them with security. And these are the countries of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as well as Australia, South Korea, and Japan. And so we're going to be focusing a lot of efforts in these countries and on the nuclear armed. And that's where the normative impacts of the treaty really come into play. As Ambassador White was saying in her remarks, you know, the big thing about this treaty has been that it helps us to stigmatize and delegitimize nuclear weapons. And that was always the incentive for this treaty. It's not like we didn't know the nuclear armed states weren't going to support it, or that we were surprised when they boycotted negotiations. We knew that would happen. And the point was really to do this without them in order to create a strong law that we could use as a tool to garner support around the world for nuclear abolition. We've seen how this works with landmines and cluster bombs. For example, the United States has not joined either of those treaties and yet does not use landmines anywhere except for the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. The United States has stopped producing cluster munitions. And we can see that even while these weapons are not completely eliminated and are still used in certain conflicts, they're met with universal condemnation and outcry by the international community. And so we can already see this today. If you look even online at Twitter, if you look at the hashtag nuclear ban, you can see governments around the world saying nuclear deterrence is over. Your nuclear weapons cannot exist in this new world order. This isn't just ICANN saying this, this is countries of the world saying this. So you can already see how that kind of normative impact is starting to be felt. And we'll talk a little bit about divestment later on, but that's going to be one of the key things around this as well, in terms of putting pressure on nuclear weapon producing companies and the countries that possess them. And I think the last thing I want to point out here about normative impact is, if you're wondering if this really, really works, despite the examples that I've given, you know, one, look at any change that we've seen in history. It hasn't come from the people engaged in the negative behavior. The abolition of slavery didn't happen because slavers decided to stop enslaving people. We didn't get bans on cigarette smoking, to give another example, because cigarette companies or smokers decided to stop. It came from people agitating against the systems that were creating problems for the world. Women were the ones that agitated for their rights to vote. Black and other people of color are the ones that have advocated for civil rights. LGBTQ folks have been the ones that have agitated for the rights and recognitions that we've received today. And in all of these cases, as Ambassador White said, it's not as if everything is solved in a moment. These are long processes of iterative change. And this treaty is part of that iterative change when it comes to nuclear weapons. And finally, as an example of why we're already seeing this work, you only have to look at the way the nuclear armed states are reacting to this treaty. They have put so much effort into trying to stop this treaty. It's been incredible to watch. They have done at the highest diplomatic levels, I'm talking presidents of countries of the nuclear armed states calling the governments of these countries that led this initiative to ban the bomb to try and get them to not do it. There have been instructions from the US government to NATO allies to boycott. The US government, in a completely unprecedented move, actually asked countries to unratify the treaty. That's never happened before in the making of any international law. So they're scared. They know what this treaty will do for their weapons.
Ray, it's so inspiring to hear that broad overview about normative change and about how this treaty is going to bring about what Ambassador White was talking about, what you're talking about, universal condemnation of nuclear weapons as an instrument, as a legitimate instrument of security. So it's so inspiring where we are and where we're headed right now. Thank you. So next, I want to ask you, ICANN and its member organizations have some very inspiring campaigns for the treaty that we can all get involved in. And I really want people to hear what we can do today. And so one of them is how to get your country on board. One is the city's appeal. One is a legislators campaign, establishing nuclear free zones where you live. And then this Don't Bang on the Bomb divestment campaign. And I'm excited to see the progress that's been made on all of these campaigns. And you can see a lot of this on the ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons website. They have updates, status updates on what's going on in all of these campaigns. But I'm really, really especially excited about the Bank on the Bomb campaign, which focuses on divesting from the 26 companies that produce nuclear weapons, because we've seen divestment change the game with apartheid in South Africa, with cluster munitions and landmines, and now increasingly with the fossil fuel industry. So if you could walk us through, in particular, the Don't Bang on the Bomb campaign, and now that the treaty has entered into force, what impact will the treaty and this divestment campaign have on the nuclear weapons producers, on countries that have ratified the treaty and those they do business with, including the 9 nuclear armed states? And if you could also, just as part of this, share personally how we can get involved to bring our cities on board, et cetera. I think people would really like to know. It'd be really helpful. And I'm going to put some campaign links into the chat that are also on the Humanity Rising website with this session. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, and Richard, if you wouldn't mind putting up that slide of the nuclear weapon. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So these are some of the companies that are involved in producing nuclear weapons. These are the ones that are targeted by the Don't Bang on the Bomb campaign. And what we're looking to do there is to get financial institutions, pension funds, banks, all of them to remove their money from these producers. This campaign started well before we got the treaty. It's been a collaboration of ICANN and one of our partners in the Netherlands, PAX. And it's modeled on the divestment campaigns from landmines and cluster munitions, and also lessons learned from the other campaigns that you mentioned, Cynthia. And there's a few dimensions to it. One is the personal dimension. You can go onto don'tbankonthebomb.com and you can look up your bank around the world. We have many countries that are covered in this on the website. So you can look to see if your own bank, if your own money is invested in nuclear weapon producers. If it is, then you can call your bank and ask them to withdraw their support from nuclear weapon producers, and there's samples of emails and letters and phone conversations that you can have on the website. There's also examples of other banks that have done that. So I live in New York City, and one of our banks here, Amalgamated Bank, is one of the sort of gold star standards of divestment from nuclear weapon producers. So you can use them as an example of how it's possible. And you can also look at your pension fund if you have one with your company or your business, to see if you can withdraw those funds also. And if your pension fund or your bank won't shift, then you can shift, move your money away from the bank that's investing in nuclear weapon producers. There's also a lot of work that we have going on at the city level. So for example, here in New York City, we have some legislation that's currently before the city council to divest New York City pension funds. So that's teachers and firefighters, et cetera, from nuclear weapon producing companies. And so that type of work is also something that you can get involved in your city or town to make sure that you're not investing in nuclear weapons. And along with that, you can get your city council or your mayor or whatever the domestic process is to endorse the ICANN Cities Appeal. And that's a way to get your city or your town to register that it supports the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that it wants your government, your federal government, to join, and that it rejects nuclear weapons. So this really builds on the movement from the 1980s and further back to develop nuclear weapon free zones in cities and towns. It's sort of the modern iteration of that, and so many cities around the world have joined in that effort. And so there's all kinds of things that you can do locally for that, and you can make big public events of it. You can protest outside of your banks. Here in New York on New Year's Day, we did a polar plunge into the Atlantic Ocean to call on City Council to adopt the new legislation that it has on its docket. So yeah, it can be a really fun thing to engage with within your community.
That's great. And Ray, that's so helpful, and so many wonderful ways that we can take action in our lives. Can you just touch briefly on the impact on the countries that have ratified the treaty in terms of these companies and those they do business with? Just touch briefly on what the impact is, how it's going to spread across borders potentially, from what I understand. Because these companies are multinational and they may be working in one country that's ratified the treaty that might have an impact on another country that hasn't ratified the treaty in terms of moving things forward.
Yeah, the treaty itself outlaws any assistance with prohibited activities. And so in the context of the landmine and cluster bomb treaties, this has incorporated divestment along with that, so that there will be pressure on any countries that have ratified this treaty that in order to be in compliance with the treaty, they can't be giving any assistance to the development, modernization, or production or deployment of nuclear weapons. So this may have an impact as the treaty enters into force and becomes implemented by the states parties. In terms of those types of business arrangements, they're going to have to look at that internally and see if they have any collaborations that need to be adjusted or altered. And some of the states parties have adopted national legislation when they ratified the treaty that have said they won't invest in nuclear weapon producing companies, or that have said they won't participate in any maneuvers that would allow nuclear weapons to transit across their territories or waters. So there's lots of these different types of things that is really going to start rolling out now that the treaty's entered into force, and we'll see the different ways that states parties have to adjust their own behavior, because even nuclear-free countries are entangled in a lot of this, and unwittingly or without even knowing it. And so I think it's a good opportunity to really take a hard look at how we unwittingly support the nuclear weapon enterprise personally, and as nuclear-free governments as well.
It's a very exciting time. It's really what's ahead. What do you think is the single most important thing that people can start to do right now to advance the treaty and move us closer to the abolition of nuclear weapons? What is the one thing you think is the most important thing?
You know, this isn't something that is specific work on the treaty. We've talked about divestment and cities and all these other things that you can do, but I really think the most important thing you can do in your daily life right now is to embrace this new reality. You know, instead of saying or doubting that this will ever work or that it's naive, it's to really accept that this has happened and that things have changed, and that we are chipping away at the institutions of power and violence. And I think that is the most important thing that we can do, is to support that, to talk about that, to spread that message, and think about also how it relates to your own work. I'm sure many people on this call, their primary issue might not be nuclear weapons, but you might be working on climate change or the abolition of police or prisons, or Black Lives Matter or queer rights. You know, whatever you're working on, I think acknowledging the different ways that we can confront power and the ways that each of us doing this really supports each other's work and the overall systems and structures of violence and power that we're all confronting together. That's how we build community that believes that change is possible and that is then willing to act for it. So I think that's probably the most important thing in this moment.
That's great. Just changing the way we talk and think about this, and changing that narrative. So important. So my last question to you for this time is to say that, you know, you've done trailblazing work on intersectionality, which you've just referenced, and the role of women in the movement to abolish nuclear weapons. You, Ambassador White, Beatrice Finn, Bakasha Setsuko Thurlow, and thousands of other women around the world have played a leadership role in campaigning for the treaty, getting it adopted by the UN and now ratified by what's now, this as of today, 52 countries. What do you see as the role of women in this next phase? And what will your focus be at reaching critical will? And I know you have a book coming out, which I'm going to put in the chat, called Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy. And just what is your vision for your book and the role it will play in this next phase of your work and to abolish nuclear weapons and for the TPNW?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, as you say, women and feminists have really driven the anti-nuclear movement from its beginning, not just this process, but throughout history, and will continue to do so. But I also want to note, of course, it's not just about women, but also about gender diverse and gender fluid people, and importantly, intersectional feminists. So people who acknowledge and promote this understanding that we all have different experiences of oppression, different experiences of life based on all of our various intersecting identities in this world. And so I think one of the most important things that I'll be working on, and have been working on and will continue to work on, is really to promote the idea that it's not just about adding people of certain identities. It's not just about adding women to existing institutions or processes. Of course, participation and diversity is incredibly important, but I think what's the most important thing in that is creating the space for the different ideas and perspectives and experiences to actually change those institutions and processes, because we can see the ways in which you know, we can add women into an institution of violence, like the nuclear weapon complex or the military industrial complex, and it doesn't change that system, because once you're within that system, you're beholden to it in order to hold on to your position. And so you tend to conform yourself to it and you become indoctrinated within it. So the really compelling thing about intersectional feminism and our work on confronting power is the ways in which we can mobilize diverse constituents of people in order to actually change the thinking around things, change institutions, build new institutions and processes, which is one of the things that we did with this treaty by completely bypassing the traditional patriarchal structures within the UN system that are normally where nuclear weapons are discussed, and taking it into, as you say, the most democratic space the UN has to offer, which is the General Assembly, and by allowing all countries to have an equal voice, and by allowing activists into the room as active participants, and allowing survivors to guide a lot of the strategy and shaping of the treaty. And that is what my book's about. To get to the second part of your question, it tries to explore all of this history. You know, it's one story of the ban. Of course, there's many stories that could be told about the making of this treaty, but this one is from the perspective of an anti-war feminist activist who was involved from the very beginning through to the adoption of the treaty. And it tries to look at the ways that the treaty has changed things in terms of process, in terms of discourse and narrative, and what our hopes are for this treaty and for this movement, the anti-nuclear movement, and the abolitionist movement more broadly moving forward from here. And it's a really feminist accounting of the process, the pressure against it, the activist campaign. It tries to be an honest accounting of things that we got right or that we got wrong, as I can, because I'm hoping it's a useful tool for other organizers and activists in years to come of how you can do things like this and how it's possible.
Well, it sounds like it's truly going to be a gift for all of us who want to know more. And I'm really looking forward to reading it. And I really appreciated how you've clarified and identified that it doesn't matter if you continue to operate just by bringing representation into the existing patriarchal systems. That's not going to change anything. You have to create a new space where these diverse conversations can take place and where people can be heard who don't normally have a voice. So thank you for that clarification. And now I'm going to come to you, Rebecca. Thanks, Ray. Rebecca, my first question to you is that, first of all, just to say welcome again.
Thank you.
You have dedicated yourself over the past decade in so many ways to the abolition of nuclear weapons. You've worked with Habakasha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with youth from around the world, including youth from Pacific Island communities who have been disproportionately impacted by nuclear testing. So just again to you, so grateful for all that you're doing and all this important work that has helped bring us to this moment today. So how are you feeling today about the treaty entering into force? And what does this mean for you personally? And what does it mean for our world?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me today and inviting me to share my story. I think my experience is a little bit different from our other two guests, and I'm honored to be here and share that with you all. As you said, Cynthia, I've dedicated my life to this, but approaching it in a very different way. I feel like it kind of found me and took over in a really wonderful and beautiful way. But by trade, I'm an educator, and I write curriculum and textbooks, and I train teachers and administrators. So I was working in Japan doing that. And when as an educator, I felt it was really important to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki and learn from a firsthand account what happened, especially since my background, my family, my grandmother is Indonesian, and she was actually in a Japanese concentration camp during World War II. So my family history with the bomb is very intermingled, I'll say, and kind of twisted. My grandmother maintained until the day that she died that the only reason that I'm alive is because of the bomb. She was able to escape the concentration camp during that week that the two bombs were dropped on Japan. So that was my very passive, because it wasn't something that we spoke about in my family. It was just kind of a known thing that we don't talk about Japan, we don't talk about World War II, because it was very, it was a lot for my grandmother. So it kind of left that there. And then when I went to Japan, I was like, you know, it's important for me to understand this history. So going and experiencing Hiroshima and understanding that the history and the education that I received about what happened and what nuclear weapons are, how they're used, what they do to people, what they do to everyday people, was so incredibly different from what actually happened. And it was very emotional for me. It was very like overwhelming to be in Japan and to see the impact that these weapons had, and to know my country had a part in this, but then also like my family history. It was very overwhelming. I was extremely upset. I still get choked up thinking about it. It's a lot. But a survivor in the park, there are many survivors posted all over Hiroshima in the Peace Park, and they do tours, they share their family's history. It's a really beautiful way of them, it's the way that they are activists. It's the way that they advocate by telling their stories and hoping that people will start to understand the true impact. So I was sitting outside of the dome, and there's a gentleman who is there every single day. He has dedicated his life to nuclear abolition by telling his family story. So he saw me very upset, and he stopped his tour, he came over, he sat with me, and we spent the entire day together. And he kind of walked me through how him, as a Japanese survivor, still had so much love and compassion in his heart to come and rescue this American who's all upset sitting in front of the A-bomb dome. So through his story and through his compassion, I, as an educator, I was like, okay, what can I do to help this situation? Like there must be one small thing I can do from my field, or like from my space. So we were talking, and his biggest message to the world was just understand what happened in Hiroshima. If you understand, like, you won't do it anymore, just understand. It's like, okay, I do that. I'm an educator, I can do that. So I told him that I was going to make a documentary about his life and make a curriculum to go along with it and implement it into schools in the US. That was the path. That's how this all got started. I'm very excited. He'll be joining me this evening for our celebration. We've got balloons up, but I'm just so, I'm very moved, and I'm very touched by the graciousness that I received in Japan. And that was in 2009. So since that moment, I've dedicated my time and my life to getting that story out.
Thank you, Rebecca. You've brought me to tears. And also, just, I love your balloons. I just have to say, on the happy side, this is quite a moment for you, I'm sure. And that you'll be with your friend tonight is really amazing. Who inspired you to be doing all of this? So my next question for you is, your organization Peak is a partner of ICANN, and a core part of your work is mentoring youth. You've done path-breaking work with youth on the TPNW, training them to become activists for nuclear abolition. You've also prepared young people to take part in high-level discussions about the treaty at the UN, which have really made a difference. And you bring the creative arts, the heart, joy, and fun to this work. You talked to me about the importance of all that, and it really touched me. So Tell us about one of the most inspiring experiences you've had working with youth on the TPNW, inspiring for you and for the youth, please.
Wonderful. Yes, very happy to share some fun stories. And as you mentioned, I think I'd like to piggyback a little bit off of what Ray was just talking about, the importance of sharing these stories and starting these conversations. And that's really the idea of my organization. Starting to understand the lack of representation, and also starting to understand how having people who are affected by what we're talking about in the room makes such a huge difference in the way that negotiations happen, even in the way that discussions happen. So my inspiring story comes from New Zealand, and from we helped organize a youth conference in correlation with a high-level political forum. So these high-level forums where negotiations happen, it was for all of the Pacific nations coming together and figuring out how they were going to ratify, because as Mary and many of the other panelists mentioned, the United States and all of the NATO countries were out in force, really, and the smaller countries, they were pressuring, threatening them with taking away aid and a number of other things that if they signed, they would no longer have support. So the Pacific Island nations came together to determine how they were going to sign and support one another and make a united front. I decided that it was going to be really, really important at that delegation to also have youth involved, for the delegates to be able to speak to the young people in this movement, as well as for the young people to have an opportunity to talk about their countries, what's happening in their countries. And they have some very important and pressing questions, specifically around Article 6, which we call victims assistance, but I'd like that changed to survivors assistance. That's just a side note. But there was a lot of discussion, and for the students coming from the Pacific, this was their number one concern. Now, at the conference, the treaty had not entered into force yet, so the kind of response and kind of canned response that the students were getting from the diplomats and those at the high level forum was, we'll get to that once the treaty enters into force. Like, we're not here to talk about what happens after. We're here to talk about the treaty. We'll get to that later. The students felt very dismissed. They were very upset. It was the one thing that they came there to talk about, and they really wanted to have an in-depth conversation about it. So through that week, we worked with them. We found ways for them to continue to talk about the treaty entering into force, but bringing in Article 6 into the way that we were talking about it. It didn't have that big of an impact until the final day. So this is the moment that was just so moving and really spoke to me and showed me that the approach that we're taking has such a huge impact. And Ray had mentioned also the big impact it had in the UN. Of having survivors present. So not only just having survivors present, but finding a way to have them share their story that is moving, that touches the heart. And this comes back to the heart-centered leadership and why it's so incredibly important. One of the reasons I was so excited to be here today, it was beautiful that we opened with a meditation and starting with our heart. That's where this work really needs to be centered. So in the final hours of our conference, the Pacific students gave a presentation. They presented their artwork. And there were videos, there were poems, there was a dance, and there were paintings. And through their stories and their storytelling, they were able to get across just the gravity of the impact that the testing has had on them and their families and their children and for generations. And it was extraordinarily moving. The diplomats and ambassadors in the room were brought to tears, which is something I've not personally seen being in and out of the UN, having dignitaries allow themselves to work through and feel from their heart. And the conversation after their presentation was night and day from the rest of the conference. We were able to have an actual real conversation about Article 6 and what it means, and that it's going to take a tremendous amount of work, and that most countries are not going to want to do that. It's a lot of money, and like what that actually means and why people didn't want to talk about it. It was a very candid, very real conversation, maybe not exactly what the students wanted to hear, but very appreciative that it was real. And now, knowing what is in front of them, they can make plans to tackle that. And the ambassadors and the diplomats not only had that candid conversation, but they came and they shared poems that were inspiring to them for the students. And it was a really beautiful moment. They had also shared that this experience was incredibly moving, and that they learned so much, and they committed to holding youth forums in conjunction with their high-level political forums. And as we followed up with them, we've seen that a number of the ambassadors and diplomats actually followed through, and they've started to include youth into their high-level forums, which is, you know, for us on this side is amazing to see that progress. But I think also for the students, it's just such an important space to open up, and, you know, using the art of storytelling to bring that into these spaces that are usually very devoid of anything. Most proceedings that I've been to, people are reading statements that they wrote 5-6 years ago. They change the date and they read the same thing. So to have people actually engaged from their heart and being able to start conversations from there, start negotiations from there, I think has a really, really big impact on this treaty, but also how it's going to move forward.
Rebecca, that is so beautiful. And, you know, this nuclear weapons are a matter of the heart, which is what you're saying. The change, the storytelling, when you open people's hearts with a personal story, then that's where the change comes. It's not just going to come from up here. It's just, it's here. So thank you for that. And the beautiful story. So my last question for you is a core part of your work is convening the hard conversations that we are having on diversity and inclusion. And again, thank you so much for this work you're doing to heal, in particular, our divided country. And you're doing brilliant work on the intersectionality of nuclear abolition with systemic racism and climate and social justice issues. So if you could just take us in to one of these conversations, we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like you to connect, you know, and just tell us, how do you connect in these intersectional conversations, abolition to all these other issues? How do you engage youth and inspire them to take action for abolition and the TPNW?
Thank you for that question. And I want to harken back to a lot of the things that Ray had mentioned, since I think the way that she was able to lay out the different structures that are in place and our need to disrupt them and speak truth to power. That's the core. That's the core of it. And being able to connect what is important in your own life to the work that you want to do and to inspire other people to join you. It took a while. It definitely was not something I just came up with. Having this work can eat you alive. It can take everything if you allow it to, because there's always something to do. It feels like, you know, it feels like it's never ending, and that you can give 100, 200, 300%, and it will never be enough. It can feel that way. And kind of coming from the other side of having given everything and being left with nothing personally and having to kind of rebuild my life and myself, it made me stop and think, like, if it's not sustainable to give everything, how can I make this sustainable? How can I make this something that, you know, I can continue to do, because it's really important to me? So finding the joy, finding ways to incorporate this into what I feel passionate about. And right now, with our country and where we are in the world, talking about inclusion and diversity, and those are very nice words, but it's white supremacy and racism are the words, and I'm just going to call them out. So like that's what I deal with, and that's what I'm talking about now. So the way that it's incorporated is, unfortunately, white supremacy is incorporated into everything and every aspect of our life. And it's not until we start to have those really difficult conversations and understand, and I'm talking specifically in the US right now. Yes, internationally there is racism, but it's more about power and power structures, as Ray was mentioning. So in other countries, it could be your gender that is used to subjugate and keep people in a certain space. In America, we use race, and it all is coming down to, am I able to have these conversations, like really, really difficult conversations, and bring up white supremacy and the fact that our country was founded on that? Like, if we can start to have these conversations, like that is the basis of our issues here. That's the root. So when we talk about all of these other things, nuclear weapons are an instrument of power and an instrument of control. Where does that power and control come from in this country? It comes from white supremacy. It comes from patriarchy. So until we can start to have those conversations and get people on the same page, we're not even living in the same realities. Like, the reality of this country is very different depending on the color of your skin. And being of mixed race, depending on the time of year, I'm very dark or I'm very light, and I can pass either way. And I experience and I see it firsthand. Depending on how I wear my hair and what season it is, I get treated extraordinarily different in the spaces that I go. So for me, it's easy, it's simple, because that's my space and I feel passionate about it. For someone else who's working on climate, I'm going to tie this all into a nice bow. The way that we bring it all together for me is divestment, because we talk about education, we talk about climate, we talk about systemic racism, we talk about all of these problems and these issues. And then the big statement, there's not money for that. We don't have money to deal with that. We don't have money to do this. It's like, oh, we've got trillions of dollars locked up in nuclear weapons. So for me, divestment has been like our rally call, and it gets people so excited because there are so many examples of divestment working in other campaigns, but even in this one specifically, like Ray was talking about the divestment campaign in New York. That's $500 million on the table, talking about being divested out of nuclear weapons just for New York City. And we have the votes. Coronavirus has, slowed things down a bit, but that's going to pass. Like, that's so exciting. And to be able to talk to young people and say, look, we got $500 million that's going to come out of the New York City pension funds. And not only that, we set up a commission so that money isn't going to just go back into fossil fuels. It will go into education. It will go into health. Like, how exciting is that? You want money for your programs? Like, it's just sitting right over there. So that's the way that I get people excited about it. And it goes to any issue that you're concerned about. You have this inroad to the one big question, or not question, but the one big statement that's always made about our processes and being progressive is that there isn't money for it. It's like, well, yeah, there is money for it. And now the world has decided that these weapons are illegal and abhorrent, so that all of that money is sitting there wasting away. Like, release that, and now we have what we need to work and tackle these other issues.
Rebecca, that was such a gift, and you're doing such powerful work. And thank you for tying it all together the way you do every day, and for bringing this to us today. It's so important. It's so illuminating. It's the investment as the way forward. It's really exciting to help us with everything else we need to work on. Yeah. So Jim, I have a question for you. Do we need to wrap up right now? I have had one final question for all the panelists, but how are we doing?
Please take your time. Keep your comments brief, but yes, let's take the time to have natural closure.
Okay, thank you, dear Jim. Okay, I have one final question for all three of you, and you can go in any order, whoever's moved to speak first, but if you all want to turn your videos on. So my final question is, on this historic day that we're celebrating together here with this blessed humanity rising, as the treaty's entering into force, what is your hope? What is your prayer for the TPNW? And what is your message for all the wonderful people we have gathered with us here today at Humanity Rising? Whoever wants to go first.
No one ever wants to go first. That's the problem with making change. Everyone's afraid to go first. Well, I guess my hope is that the legacy that the survivors have given us, the lessons that they've given us, the passion and the compassion that they've given us can really be carried forward in this movement for nuclear abolition and for all of our abolitionist projects and work that we all do, and that we can find community with each other to build on each other's successes and hold each other up and celebrate each other and celebrate the victories, but don't let the victories make us complacent or think that this is over or we've done our part. And I also really want to honor the fact that there were a few people, I don't want to get emotional myself right now, but there have been a few people in this process to ban nuclear weapons that have passed away within the last few years and, really dedicated their lives, including Irish diplomat Michael Hurley, IPPNW activist Bob Matanga, and Bill Williams, who was one of the co-founders of ICANN in Australia. And they dedicated their lives and their passion to this, and they didn't make it to see entry into force. So we'll celebrate for them tonight and honor them tonight as well, and everyone else that we have lost along the way. But hopefully new people are joining the movement today to carry it forward. So thank you.
Celebrating for all of them and everyone. Thank you, Ray. Okay, who's next, Mary or Rebecca?
I'll speak. I want to just embrace all of us as peaceful warriors and remind us that evolutionary change comes in baby steps and also in leaps. And another thing that comes in leaps is hope and faith. And this is a leap, and we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Thank you, Mary. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Mwah. Okay, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm just so excited and honored to share this day with the Hibaksha. They've been fighting for this for over 75 years, and all of the activists that have also dedicated their lives to this work. It's so incredibly inspiring and exciting. And to piggyback off of what Mary just mentioned, one thing that always comes up for me in these moments is the thought of transformation and how transformation is possible. I mean, like metamorphosis and transformation, it's in our DNA, it's in our bones. And it starts with changing our mind and our hearts. So I encourage everyone to find what makes you feel passionate. And if you're interested in this work, like there is a way to incorporate it into what you already feel passionate about, and make sure that you feel that passion. Like if it feels like, that sounds like no, that's not it. You gotta be excited about it. It brings joy, it brings excitement. That's how this work gets done. If you're not excited about it, if you don't feel good about it, nobody's gonna join you. I encourage us all to kind of step away from the fear of it and talking about the fear and start talking about the joy, talking about what is possible, what we can do with this newfound money, with this newfound, like all of the positive sides. There's enough for us to be scared about. So as as we shift and talk and nuclear weapons become stigmatized, talk about how exciting that is. Like, let's talk about the joy and the passion. That would be my hope and my prayer for this movement.
Thank you, Rebecca, bringing in the heart, bringing in the joy. You do it so beautifully. I just want to now just bring this to circle to a moment to just thank you again, Ray, Mary, Rebecca, for your extraordinary work, for all that you do every day, for making history with the entry into force of the TPNW today, and also just to you, Jim, and all of you with us here on Humanity Rising, for being with us for this celebration, for listening to these extraordinary women who are inviting all of us to join them in making history with this treaty. And they've shown us and inspired us about what we need to do next. So let's do it. And let's decide right now, let's set the intention in this sacred circle of Humanity Rising together with people all over the world that we're going to ban nuclear weapons forever. It's done. May it be so. May it be so. So I just want to, the very last words are that a few years ago, it's been said that the majority of the people in the nuclear security community, at least in the United States, said that the TPNW would never get 50 ratifications and it would never come into force, and that today would never happen. But here we are. And if we can do this, we can do the rest. And just to close with one of my favorite quotes from the great Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Cynthia, and all of you for what a beautiful, beautiful program. I think, Ray, you made a very profound statement when you said, no one wants to go first. That's why change is so difficult. And you know, you're absolutely right. There's something in all of us when the teacher asks us to kind of raise our hand or do anything, we all kind of wait to see what somebody else is going to do. And that's why change is so incredibly challenging. And that's the genius of the leader. The leader is that person who actually is not only willing, but eager to go first and to empower the way. And so I just want to acknowledge, Cynthia, your leadership, all of the leadership that everyone has demonstrated, Mary, Ray, Rebecca, Puna. I mean, this treaty happened because of women. This treaty happened because of the rising leadership of women around the world. And I just think that's a very important aspect of our celebration today. This would not have happened without feminine power. And I was very struck, by the way, as someone who's been in the nuclear domain for many, many decades now. I had always known that the radiation affected pregnant women, but I really hadn't taken in that women and girls are far more susceptible to damage, sort of generally. So that's a very important fact to get out there. So there's deep synchronicity in the fact that the first treaty to actually ban nuclear weapons came from those parts of our society that are the most vulnerable. And I think this is important, everyone, for the reason that we observed a couple of weeks ago about the election in the United States. And your point, Rebecca, that racism in the United States is probably more lethal than maybe racism anywhere else in the world. Remember George Floyd. And yet, who was it that swept Joe Biden and Kamala Harris into power? Who made that critical difference? It was the people of color, particularly women of color. And then when it came right down to the razor's edge in the state of Georgia, as to whether the Democrats were going to get a majority in the Senate at this critical moment, who delivered us? People of color, led by women of color. And here we have today, everyone, the people that are the most vulnerable are the people that are ensuring our redemption. And there's a deep and profound truth here that I think is worth all of our contemplation. And it's the meek that will inherit the earth. It's the peacemakers that will endure for all time. And we are all thereby inspired by this session. And by the way, I want to encourage all of you to go up on our Ubiverse, our social platform, and post anything you would like our community to learn more about, your book, the different organizations. Please go up on our Ubiverse and write a blog, and so that we can disseminate awareness about this very important initiative as extensively as we possibly can. And then I also want to welcome everybody to join our after session chat. Stan or Leslie, if you can put the link in one more time before we close. It's a wonderful time for people to engage more informally in some of these discussions. And then today's Friday, we're going to take the weekend off, as we always do. And then on Monday, we're going to have a celebration of one of the great treasures of our time, Stan Grof, who has been one of the pioneers in the human potential movement, who this year is going to be turning 90 years old. So we have Michael Murphy, the founder of the Esalen Institute. We have Rick Tarnas, the professor of philosophy and cosmology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Jim Hickman. All of them have known Stan for 40, 50 years. Stan has been one of the pioneers with Albert Hoffman in research in the psychedelics. He was the one who, as really the successor of Jung, took the notion of the unconscious into the transpersonal domains, and made a breakthrough that neither Freud nor Jung even thought about. That the human being, every human being, is actually shaped in the womb of the mother. Psychiatry and psychology before Stan Grof thought that we started sort of at birth. And it was Stan that began to realize that, no, we begin in the womb and even before we enter the womb, and that there's a transgenerational aspect to what shapes our individual lives. So we're going to start our celebration of Stan on Monday, and then every month until his birthday on July 1st, we're going to be bringing in different notable people from around the world who've known and worked with him, and we're going to celebrate that great life starting on Monday. But I deeply, deeply thank this panel today. The nuclear weapons issue is arguably the critical issue. It symbolizes the toxicity in the human psyche by which we continue to enslave ourselves. And your statement at the end, Rebecca, that it's all related to every other issue is so fundamentally true. every road leads to Rome. And at the center of it is our ongoing insistence that we hold the human race hostage to weapons of mass destruction. And today is a great day in the annals of history, the first treaty to actually ban them. And now we have to work together in the spirit of Chekhov. It is great lines that it's only drop by drop we squeeze the slave out of ourselves. That's our task as we move forward today. But one drop has been squeezed out, thanks to the women. So thank you all. This has been a beautiful, beautiful session. Cynthia, I love you. Beautiful, beautiful.
Love you
Thank
too,
you,
Jim.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same station here on Zoom. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Cynthia, once again for creating a beautiful circle that we are
You all
part
did
of.
it.
Thank you.
You all did it. Thank you all. It was so
Yeah,
beautiful.
thank you.
It's
It was
so
wonderful
beautiful.
to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so honored.